It means, therefore, if you're going to understand what Jesus is saying in all of his teachings, if you're going to understand what the apostles taught in their details, you will need to read the books that they read from. If you're going to get the details of what they taught, both Jesus and the apostles, you will need to read the books that they read from. And the books that they read from was Genesis to Malachi. So I said to you that you need the Old Testament to read the New Testament. And you need the New Testament to read the Old Testament. You need both. So when then does it appear that the Old Testament and the New Testament books are different? Why does it appear like that? Why does it appear like the Old Testament is different from the New Testament? Well, they are not different. There are two things that mark them out. There are two things, two fundamental things that differentiate between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Or we can say that distinguishes the Old Testament from the New Testament. Number one is the language. Language. We have said that God has no language in terms of the language that God uses. God's language is the language of anybody that God inspires. God's language is the language of anybody that God inspires. If he inspires an Englishman, his language will be English. If God inspires an Ibibio man, his language will be Ibibio. So it means whatever language you read the Bible in is the language of the author. So God will use the language definitely. And when he uses the language, of course, language cannot exist in isolation of culture. So when he uses the language, he will have to use the culture of that language. So usually, what we don't understand is the language and the culture. And it is a lack of understanding of the language and culture that makes it look like the Old Testament and the New Testament contradict each other. But there is no contradiction. There's a perfect harmony to all of them once you understand the language. The language. So the first is the language. Genesis to Malachi is basically in Hebrew. Of course, we have some Greek translation of Genesis to Malachi, which is what we call the Septuagint Greek. The Septuagint Greek is Hebrew to Greek of the Old Testament.